In 1943, the Dnieper's tributaries turned into rivers of fire, where men didn't just drown in water, but in history itself. This was not a crossing, it was a crucifixion of two armies, fought on frozen currents and burning bridges. What happened on these forgotten waters shaped the road to Berlin and buried a generation beneath the flood. In the summer of 1943, the Eastern Front stretched across 1,000 kilometers of devastated land. Fields once rich with harvests were scorched, villages erased, and the vast network of rivers, the Dnieper and its tributaries, had become natural fortresses. The collapse of German defenses at Kursk in July marked not only a turning point in military momentum, but also the beginning of one of the most grueling operations in the war, the crossing of the Dnieper. The battle that followed would not be confined to the great river itself, but would engulf its tributaries, the Desna, the Soj, and the Pripyat, where entire divisions fought, drowned, and burned in the effort to seize or defend every meter of shoreline. The strategic and political stakes could not have been higher. For the Soviet Union, the Dnieper represented both a military challenge and a symbol of liberation. The river divided occupied Ukraine. Beyond it lay the key industrial cities of Kyiv, Dnipropetrovsk, and Zaporizhzhia. Stalin viewed the offensive not only as a military necessity, but also as a political obligation, proof that the Red Army could reclaim its homeland and carry the war into the heart of Europe. He demanded that the river be crossed without delay, regardless of obstacles, an order that would lead to some of the most catastrophic casualty rates of the war. For Germany, the Dnieper and its tributaries offered the last defensible barrier before the western Ukrainian plains. After the retreat from the Oral and Kharkiv salients, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, commander of Army Group South, argued for a controlled withdrawal to the river line to shorten the front and establish strong defensive positions. Yet Hitler, unwilling to concede more territory, insisted that the Wehrmacht hold the east bank as long as possible. His order to stand fast meant that thousands of German troops would remain in exposed positions while Soviet armies advanced in overwhelming strength. The operational context was defined by exhaustion on both sides. The Wehrmacht in late 1943 was a shadow of its former self. Army Group South, stretched over more than 700 kilometers, had only 700 operational tanks and around 900,000 men, many under strength. The Soviet fronts opposing them, the Voronezh, Steppe, and Central fronts, fielded over 2 million soldiers, supported by 2,400 tanks and 4,000 aircraft. Yet despite numerical superiority, the Red Army faced severe logistical problems. Its supply lines were overextended, rail networks destroyed, and bridges over the tributaries in ruins. Every movement westward required rebuilding transport infrastructure while under air and artillery attack. The geography of the Dnieper basin compounded these difficulties. The river's tributaries, though smaller, were treacherous in their own right, wide, swampy, and bordered by dense forests or steep banks. In many sectors, bridges had been blown up by retreating German engineers, forcing Soviet troops to rely on improvised means of crossing. In others, German artillery positions on higher ground dominated the approaches, turning every attempt to ford the river into a death trap. The Desna, flowing from the north through Chernigov, became one of the first major obstacles. To the south, the Soch and the Pripyat formed natural defensive lines where German divisions dug in behind minefields, machine gun nests, and anti-tank obstacles. Intelligence assessments on both sides reflected the uncertainty of the coming battles. Soviet reconnaissance indicated that the Germans were preparing a large-scale withdrawal behind the Dnieper, but misjudged the strength of the rear defenses. Conversely, German intelligence underestimated the Soviet capacity to carry out simultaneous crossings across a 600-kilometer front. Both sides thus entered the campaign under illusions, the Germans expecting a slower Soviet pursuit, the Soviets anticipating disorganized resistance. Neither foresaw the scale of destruction that would follow. As the Red Army advanced westward after Kursk, momentum became its own enemy. Supply shortages, attrition, and logistical breakdowns forced commanders to choose between halting for reorganization or maintaining pressure on retreating German units. Stalin's orders left no room for hesitation. On August 26, 1943, the Central Front, under General Konstantin Rokossovsky, and the Voronezh Front, under General Nikolai Vatutin, received direct instructions to reach and cross the Dnieper within 3 weeks. This timeline was militarily unrealistic, yet politically non-negotiable. The Soviet state needed victory narratives, and the river crossings promised exactly that, a triumph that could be broadcast to both domestic and Allied audiences. In the German High Command, internal divisions deepened. Manstein argued for mobile defense, urging flexibility and local counterattacks. Hitler, however, saw retreat as betrayal. His refusal to allow organized withdrawal trapped several divisions east of the tributaries, forcing them into delaying battles that cost irreplaceable men and equipment. The Second Army near Chernigov and the Eighth Army near Kremenchuk found themselves under constant assault, retreating piecemeal while Soviet artillery systematically targeted every bridge and ferry. The air war intensified as well. Luftwaffe units, though diminished, launched repeated strikes on Soviet pontoon-building operations, while the Red Air Force retaliated by bombing German supply routes and rear areas. By early September 1943, the front lines reached the eastern banks of the Dnieper's tributaries. Smoke rose from burning villages as retreating German engineers set fire to everything that could be used by the enemy. The landscape became a wasteland of blackened forests, flooded lowlands, and charred wooden bridges. Hence the name. The destruction was so widespread that entire divisions reported losing orientation in terrain that no longer resembled its own maps. This was the stage upon which one of the most brutal episodes of the Eastern Front would unfold. The Dnieper's tributaries, though secondary in geography, became primary in bloodshed. Soviet soldiers, armed with little more than planks, barrels, and boats, would soon be ordered to cross under fire to secure footholds on the western banks. German divisions, entrenched and desperate, would fight to hold each ridge and river bend as if defending the Reich itself. Both armies knew that what happened along these burning waters would determine not just the fate of Ukraine, but the course of the war on the Eastern Front. By mid-September 1943, the advance toward the Dnieper's tributaries had become a test of endurance rather than maneuver. The Soviet summer offensives had driven the Germans back hundreds of kilometers, but every kilometer gained came at enormous cost. Supply columns struggled across the mud of the Ukrainian steppe, and fuel shortages crippled armored mobility. Soviet infantry divisions, advancing on foot, often outpaced their own artillery and logistical support. Yet the Red Army's leadership was determined to maintain momentum, even as the front line grew increasingly chaotic. The first objective was the Desna River, a major tributary flowing south from Bryansk toward the Dnieper near Kyiv. It formed a natural barrier, and German commanders recognized its defensive potential. The Second Army, under General Walter Weiss, received orders to hold the Desna line at all costs. Defensive positions were fortified with anti-tank ditches, minefields, and pre-registered artillery zones. German engineers destroyed all permanent bridges, leaving only a few makeshift ferries for local communication. Villages along the eastern bank were evacuated or burned, creating open killing zones where Soviet troops would be exposed during any crossing attempt. The Soviets began their approach under constant air attack. The Luftwaffe, operating from airfields near Gomel and Konotop, launched hundreds of sorties daily, targeting troop columns and pontoon material. Despite these losses, reconnaissance units of Rokossovsky's Central Front reached the Desna in the second week of September. Forward observers reported that the western bank was held by entrenched German infantry supported by artillery batteries positioned on elevated ground. Crossing without air or artillery superiority seemed impossible. But Moscow's orders were unambiguous. The river had to be forced immediately. Preparations began under cover of darkness. Soviet engineers worked feverishly to assemble pontoons and rafts from available material, timber from destroyed houses, barrels, and even doors. Entire battalions carried boats by hand through the forest to avoid detection. On September 12th at dawn, artillery opened the first preparatory barrage. It lasted 20 minutes. When the guns fell silent, assault units of the 13th Army began paddling across. German flares illuminated the river, and machine guns opened fire almost instantly. The Desna turned into a killing field. Rafts overturned, men drowned, and boats caught fire from tracer rounds. Survivors reached the western shore only to find themselves trapped in shallow trenches under continuous bombardment. The first crossings failed almost completely. Soviet casualties numbered in the thousands within hours. Yet the attacks continued. Rokossovsky ordered simultaneous assaults at multiple points to stretch the German defenses. At Novgorod-Seversky, near the northern sector, elements of the 70th Army managed to secure a small bridgehead. Engineers ferried over artillery pieces using ropes and rafts, reinforcing the foothold despite heavy losses. In other areas, entire regiments were wiped out before reaching midstream. German reports from the period noted the ferocity of Soviet persistence, describing waves of men advancing regardless of fire or obstacles. Further south, near Chernigov, the Voronezh front under General Vatutin launched its own crossing attempts. The 13th and 60th Armies attacked along a 50-kilometer stretch, facing the German 2nd Panzer Army. Here, the terrain was flatter but heavily mined, and the riverbanks were lined with reeds that caught fire under artillery bombardment. Smoke and flames covered the water, obscuring visibility for both sides. Soldiers later recalled crossing through floating debris and burning oil from destroyed boats. The reason why this sector, in Soviet correspondence, came to be called the Burning River. German counterfire was devastating. Pre-sighted artillery batteries opened up with precision, striking the banks and killing engineers before they could anchor the pontoons. At least half of the Soviet bridging equipment was destroyed in the first 48 hours. Luftwaffe Stukas returned to the front, dive-bombing any visible movement near the river, yet the pressure from the Soviet command never abated. Each failed crossing was followed by another, as reinforcements arrived to replace the fallen. The Soviet doctrine of relentless assault, reinforced by Stalin's directive that no retreat was permissible, left commanders no alternative but to continue. By September 18th, after a week of continuous fighting, the Soviets managed to secure several precarious bridgeheads along the Desna. At Novgorod-Seversky, a crossing 800 meters wide was held by elements of the 13th Army. At Chernigov, Soviet infantry finally forced the Germans to withdraw several kilometers west, allowing engineers to construct the first stable pontoon bridge under cover of night. The cost was catastrophic. Soviet losses during the Desna crossings are estimated at 60,000 men, including dead, wounded, and missing. German losses, though significantly smaller, exceeded 15,000, reflecting the intensity of the fighting. Despite the bloodshed, Soviet morale remained high. The propaganda machine immediately proclaimed the Desna crossings a success, emphasizing heroism and sacrifice. Newspapers published stories of soldiers carrying comrades across the river, of engineers building bridges under fire, and of entire platoons refusing to withdraw. In reality, the bridgeheads were still shallow and vulnerable. German counterattacks using armored reserves threatened to annihilate them daily. The 8th Panzer Division, deployed near Mina, nearly broke through the Soviet positions on September 20th before being halted by concentrated artillery fire. As September drew to a close, both sides recognized that the struggle for the tributaries was far from over. For the Soviets, the Desna crossing was only the beginning. Beyond it lay the Soch, the Pripyat, and finally the Dnieper itself, each representing another deadly obstacle. For the Germans, every withdrawal shortened their line but weakened their ability to resist. Supplies dwindled, and the Luftwaffe's presence diminished as fuel shortages grew critical. What remained constant was the intensity of the fighting and the devastation it brought to the countryside. The rivers of central Ukraine, once lifelines for agriculture and trade, had become borders of fire and death. Across the Desna, thousands of corpses floated downstream, the water thick with fuel, oil, and ash. The burning river symbolized the transformation of nature itself into a weapon, and the beginning of one of the most costly and tragic chapters of the Eastern Front. The strategic objectives behind the crossings on the Dnieper's tributaries were rooted in a combination of urgency and political necessity. In the aftermath of Kursk, Soviet leadership viewed the advance to the Dnieper not merely as a continuation of military success, but as a demonstration of the Red Army's unstoppable momentum. Stalin demanded that the river line be reached and crossed before the onset of winter, a goal that stretched logistics, manpower, and command endurance to their limits. The Stavka, Soviet High Command, planned for a multi-front operation involving more than 2.6 million troops, 2,400 tanks, and 7,000 aircraft, spread across a front exceeding 700 kilometers. The Dnieper itself was the primary target, but the tributaries, these rivers were not only geographic barriers, but also natural extensions of German defensive planning, and failure to cross them quickly risked halting the offensive momentum that had carried the Red Army across the steppe. On the German side, the situation demanded a radical reassessment of strategy. After the losses at Kursk and Orel, the Wehrmacht no longer possessed the operational reserves to mount large-scale counteroffensives. The priority became delaying the Soviet advance long enough to fortify the Panther-Wotan line, a vast defensive system intended to run along the western banks of the Dnieper and the Gulf of Finland. In practice, this line existed only on maps. Field Marshal Manstein's Army Group South and General Model's Army Group Center were expected to hold the tributaries as temporary barriers until construction of defensive works farther west could be completed. Yet Hitler's refusal to authorize early withdrawals forced the German armies to fight in exposed, improvised positions. The Dnieper's tributaries thus became killing grounds where soldiers on both sides perished for time rather than territory. Soviet operational planning reflected both ambition and haste. The Central Front, under General Rokossovsky, was tasked with crossing the Desna and pushing toward Gomel and Rachitsa to secure the northern approach to the Dnieper. To its south, the Voronezh Front under Vatutin and the Stepa Front under Konev would strike toward Kyiv and Dnipropetrovsk. Coordination among these fronts was fragile at best. Intelligence estimates underestimated the density of German forces still east of the main river, while logistical calculations assumed rates of advance that proved unrealistic once the autumn rains began. Supply convoys often failed to reach the front, and the result was a series of premature, uncoordinated assaults across multiple rivers, undertaken without full artillery or air support. The logistics of crossing operations were staggering. Soviet engineers faced the monumental task of constructing hundreds of pontoons, ferries, and improvised rafts, often using local materials under enemy fire. The destruction of infrastructure by retreating German forces exacerbated the challenge. In many sectors, bridges had been blown up twice, once during the German advance in 1941 and again during their retreat 2 years later. Fuel shortages were critical. Each armored column required tens of thousands of liters of gasoline, but the nearest functioning railheads were hundreds of kilometers to the east. Ammunition deliveries were equally delayed, forcing units to ration artillery shells even as orders demanded continuous bombardments. In response to these difficulties, Soviet planners adopted a strategy of parallel crossings. Instead of concentrating their forces on a few major bridgeheads, They ordered simultaneous assaults at dozens of points along the tributaries, hoping that at least some would succeed. This tactic spread the Germans thin, preventing them from massing their limited reserves, but it also diluted Soviet strength. Entire divisions were committed to narrow sectors of marshland or flooded plains, where movement was slow and coordination impossible. The terrain itself became the greatest enemy. Rivers swollen by early autumn rains overflowed their banks, turning adjacent fields into quagmires. Tanks sank to their turrets, and artillery guns had to be dragged by hand through the mud. German defense planning, though more methodical, suffered from equally severe constraints. Many divisions defending the tributaries were skeleton formations, composed of veterans mixed with poorly trained recruits and foreign auxiliaries. Air support, once a decisive advantage, had dwindled to a handful of operational squadrons. The Luftwaffe's priority had shifted to defending the Reich from Allied bombing, leaving the Eastern Front largely without protection. German commanders compensated through meticulous fire planning, using pre-registered artillery coordinates and camouflage to maximize defensive firepower. Every crossing attempt was met with immediate counterfire, transforming the riverbanks into mazes of shell craters and smoldering wreckage. Soviet propaganda, however, portrayed the crossings as an unstoppable tide of liberation. Stalin's directive, issued in late August, declared that the Dnieper must be crossed by the workers' army of the Soviet people as the frontier of retribution. This political officers embedded within every regiment ensured that retreat or hesitation was treated as cowardice. For engineers and infantry alike, the orders were simple: build, cross, hold, or die. To sustain morale, frontline radio broadcasts emphasized heroism over hardship, reporting rapid progress even as entire units were annihilated. The gap between rhetoric and reality widened daily. Reports from the Central Front's operational journals recorded catastrophic losses in the early phases. At the Desna alone, over 25,000 men were killed or wounded during the first week of crossings. On the Soch River, near Gomel, the 3rd Guards Army lost nearly half its strength attempting to establish a foothold. Yet, despite these figures, the offensive did not slow. Rokossovsky and Vatutin both understood that the price of delay would be greater than the price of sacrifice. German reinforcements from the west were already moving toward the Dnieper, and every day lost reduced the chance of surprise. For the Germans, time became their only weapon. Each delaying action bought precious hours for engineers constructing defenses along the main river. Hitler's orders prohibited large-scale retreats, but local commanders often disobeyed, conducting tactical withdrawals under cover of darkness. This pragmatic defiance allowed some units to escape destruction, though it deepened the rift between field officers and Berlin. The contrast between the rigid political directives and the brutal practicalities of the front defined the German experience in late 1943. By the end of September, the shape of the coming campaign was clear. The Dnieper's tributaries had become test grounds for what would soon unfold on a far grander scale. Both armies had learned, at enormous cost, that the crossing of these rivers was not a single battle, but a process of attrition measured in bodies and bridges. What awaited them ahead was the main river itself, broader, deeper, and even more unforgiving. The operations on its tributaries were merely the prelude to the crossing that would decide the fate of Ukraine, and in many ways, the fate of the Eastern Front itself. The first full-scale engagements along the Dnieper's tributaries began in late September 1943, when the Red Army attempted to convert its precarious footholds into viable bridgeheads. The Soviet Central, Voronezh, and Steppe fronts, having reached the Desna, Soj, and Pripyat rivers almost simultaneously, faced a determined and well-prepared defense. German forces, though numerically inferior, used the terrain to devastating effect. High western banks offered natural observation points, while flat eastern. Each crossing attempt turned into an ordeal fought meter by meter under constant bombardment from artillery and air attacks. At Chernigov, where Rokossovsky's Central Front concentrated its efforts, The Desna crossings entered their most intense phase. Soviet units had established small bridgeheads earlier in the month, but German counterattacks had repeatedly threatened to wipe them out. Now, reinforced by fresh divisions from the rear, the Soviets launched a coordinated assault across a 60-kilometer front. On September 22nd, the 13th and 65th Armies began the operation with a massive artillery barrage. Nearly 2,000 guns and mortars fired simultaneously, creating a wall of fire along the western bank. For 20 minutes, the sky glowed red from continuous shell bursts, and then, as the barrage shifted deeper, the assault waves pushed off in hundreds of small boats and makeshift rafts. German defenses, anchored by the Second Army under General Walter Weiss, machine guns opened fire from concealed positions, cutting down the first waves before they reached midstream. Pre-registered artillery fire followed, targeting crossing points with near-mathematical precision. Soviet engineers attempted to extend pontoon bridges under fire, but every few minutes explosions shattered the structures, sending men and equipment into the river. Soviet after-action reports describe black water filled with burning oil, ammunition, and bodies. Yet replacements kept coming. Entire regiments were rotated across to sustain pressure, ensuring that the Germans could not regroup. Further south, along the Soj River near Gomel, the 3rd Guards Army under General Alexander Gorbatov launched its own crossing operation. The terrain there was swampy, intersected by tributary streams that made movement almost impossible for heavy equipment. Soviet engineers built corduroy roads of logs and brush to move artillery to the riverbank. By the time the assault began on September 24th, most of the units were already exhausted. Still, the initial crossing succeeded in surprising the German 35th Infantry Division, which was forced to fall back several kilometers. The Soviets managed to establish a narrow bridgehead 1.5 kilometers deep. However, German counterattacks the next morning nearly destroyed it. Only concentrated Soviet artillery fire from the east bank saved the forward battalions from annihilation. To the north, the Pripyat marshes presented a different kind of battlefield, vast flooded forests where visibility was limited to a few meters. The 61st Army and partisan detachments operating behind German lines coordinated to seize ferries and bridges. Soviet archives record over 60 partisan operations in this sector, aimed at disrupting German communications and sowing confusion. Despite their efforts, the crossings proved extraordinarily difficult. Boats capsized under the weight of troops, and the cold night air claimed hundreds of lives from hypothermia. German patrols ambushed several units before they could reach the opposite shore. The struggle for the marshes lasted weeks, producing few tangible gains, but tying down large German forces that might otherwise have reinforced Chernigov and Gomel. Civilian populations trapped near the rivers suffered greatly during these battles. Villages on both banks were turned into defensive strongpoints, drawing artillery fire from both sides. Houses were demolished for timber to build rafts, barns converted into field hospitals, and wells poisoned to deny water to advancing troops. Refugees attempting to flee the combat zones often found themselves caught between opposing lines. Eyewitness accounts describe columns of villagers moving at night through burning fields, carrying what little they could on carts, while shells exploded in the distance. What lay ahead would dwarf even this destruction. The struggle for the tributaries had shown both armies the scale of the coming storm, and neither could yet imagine how high the cost would rise when the main crossing began. By the beginning of October 1943, the struggle for control over the Dnieper's tributaries had evolved into a grinding war of attrition. The Soviet forces, having secured fragile bridgeheads across the Desna and Soj, now faced the task of sustaining them under constant German counterattacks. The Wehrmacht, though battered and retreating, was determined to make each river crossing as costly as possible. The terrain, weather, and exhaustion on both sides turned every engagement into a test of endurance. Rain began to fall across northern and central Ukraine, transforming the battlefields into seas of mud. For the Soviets, momentum was both a blessing and a burden. Stalin's insistence on maintaining offensive pressure left commanders with no opportunity to consolidate their gains. Rokossovsky's Central Front reported daily shortages of ammunition and fuel, yet was ordered to press forward toward the Soch and the Dnieper. At Chernigov, where the Desna bridgeheads were now several kilometers wide, the 13th Army faced a series of determined German counterstrikes. On October 3rd, the 8th Panzer Division and the 7th Infantry Division launched a coordinated assault on the northern sector, supported by artillery from the western bank. For 3 days, combat raged around the village of Dyatlovka. Soviet engineers repaired pontoons as fast as German shells destroyed them, while infantry units fought hand-to-hand among the riverbank trenches. By the 4th day, the Germans withdrew, leaving behind hundreds. Their attack had failed to break the Soviet foothold, but succeeded in inflicting severe damage, more than 5,000 Soviet casualties, and the loss of most heavy equipment in the sector. Farther south, along the Soch near Gomel, the fighting intensified. The German 35th Infantry and 12th Panzer Divisions attempted to isolate the Soviet 3rd Guards Army's bridgehead, using concentrated artillery fire to destroy ferry lines. Soviet reinforcements crossed only at night, often under moonlight that illuminated them to German observers. Engineers used smoke screens and floating debris to conceal their movements, while artillery batteries fired continuous barrages to drown out the sounds of pontoon construction. By October 8, the bridgehead was stabilized, but at enormous cost, more than 10,000 men lost in 1 week. The Soch sector had become an open-air slaughterhouse, its waters filled with wreckage of boats, trucks, and corpses carried downstream. The Luftwaffe could no longer maintain air superiority, yet its sporadic attacks continued to inflict psychological damage on Soviet troops already under immense stress. By late October, the front lines along the tributaries had stabilized temporarily. German forces held defensive belts anchored on the western banks, while Soviet armies dug in to prepare for the next phase, the crossing of the main Dnieper. Both sides suffered catastrophic attrition. Soviet records list over 300,000 casualties in the operations east of the Dnieper between August and October 1943. German estimates indicate their own losses reached 100,000 men in the same period, including tens of thousands captured or missing. The humanitarian situation across the region deteriorated further. Entire provinces lay in ruins. Civilians who had survived the fighting faced starvation. Refugees flooded eastward into Soviet-controlled areas, overwhelming medical and logistical systems. Epidemics of typhus and dysentery spread among both soldiers and civilians. In occupied zones, German forces continued deportations for forced labor in the Reich, even as their own positions crumbled. The fighting on the Dnieper's tributaries thus entered its most desperate phase. Neither army could claim victory. The Soviets had gained ground, but paid for it with lives and material they could scarcely afford to lose. The Germans had delayed the inevitable, but at the cost of annihilating their remaining reserves. The rivers, once natural boundaries, had become open wounds stretching across the heart of Ukraine. The front now waited for the decisive struggle, the crossing of the Dnieper itself, where the full scale of the Eastern Front's brutality would reach its peak. By late October 1943, the Dnieper's tributaries had turned from obstacles into launching points for one of the largest river-crossing operations in modern warfare. Soviet engineers worked ceaselessly to reinforce the makeshift bridgeheads established in September, transforming fragile footholds into logistical arteries capable of supporting divisions. Every meter of riverbank was lined with barges, rafts, and pontoons, their skeletal frames glistening with frost as temperatures dropped. Behind them, Soviet artillery units moved into position, while supply columns brought ammunition, fuel, and food over ground that had become nearly impassable. The Central Command of the Red Army recognized that success along these tributaries would dictate the tempo of the upcoming Dnieper crossing. Stalin's direct orders emphasized speed. The Dnieper must not become a fortress. It must become a steppe. This demand left no room for operational pauses. Rokossovsky's Central Front, Vatutin's Voronezh Front, and Konev's Steppe Front were to coordinate their assaults in waves, ensuring constant pressure along the German line. By the last week of October, these orders resulted in a renewed offensive across nearly the entire eastern Ukraine and southern Belarus. German intelligence had already detected Soviet buildup activities, but could do little to respond effectively. The Wehrmacht's capacity to maneuver had been crippled by the loss of transport and fuel. Manstein's Army Group South reported barely 150 operational tanks across hundreds of kilometers of front. Many infantry divisions were reduced to half strength, sustained only by discipline and defensive engineering. German commanders concentrated their remaining resources along high ground west of the tributaries. Natural ridges and villages converted into strong points. Minefields, anti-tank ditches, and the renewed Soviet offensive began on October 25th with a massive artillery preparation along the Desna and Saj sectors. Over 4,000 guns opened fire simultaneously, shattering German trenches and cutting communication lines. Aircraft from the 16th Air Army joined the bombardment, targeting bridges and troop concentrations. The noise was so intense that seismographs hundreds of kilometers away in Moscow registered the vibrations. At dawn, the infantry advanced. Assault battalions in camouflage smocks crept toward the water under the cover of smoke and fog. German spotters, blinded by the haze, could not adjust artillery effectively. Within hours, several Soviet divisions crossed the Desna and began fanning out toward the west. The cost of this progress, however, was staggering. German counterfire inflicted catastrophic losses among the first waves. The 60th Army alone lost nearly 7,000 men in the first 2 days. Many units were forced to use logs or doors from destroyed houses as improvised rafts. Soviet engineers attempted to construct pontoon bridges at night, but Luftwaffe raids targeted the crossing sites relentlessly. The German 8th Air Corps, though diminished, concentrated its entire strength against the Desna sector. Ju-87 dive bombers swooped low over the river, dropping bombs that sent geysers of water and debris into the air. Each strike killed dozens, yet the Red Army pressed forward. Further south, the Soj front around Gomel became the scene of equally intense fighting. The city, a major German stronghold, was fortified with multiple defensive belts and heavy artillery positions. Soviet forces aimed not only to capture the city, but also to cut off retreat routes toward the Dnieper. On November 2nd, the 3rd Guards Army launched a frontal assault, supported by the 9th Tank Corps and elements of the 61st Army. The attack met with fierce resistance. German positions in Gomel's suburbs changed hands several times in a single day, with entire battalions wiped out in street fighting. The Soviets eventually encircled the city from the north and south, forcing the Germans to retreat across the river under fire. By November 9th, Gomel was in Soviet hands, but the price was enormous: over 30,000 Soviet casualties and the destruction of much of the city. As the Germans withdrew toward the main Dnieper line, they implemented a scorched earth policy of systematic destruction. Bridges, railways, and grain stores were blown up. Factories were mined and detonated before evacuation. The retreat left behind a landscape of ruin and starvation. In the regions around Chernigov and Gomel, German demolition squads destroyed over 80% of industrial infrastructure, leaving villages without electricity or water. Civilians who had survived bombardments now faced hunger and exposure as winter approached. Soviet field reports mention scenes of desperation: families sheltering in burned-out houses, children scavenging for grain among corpses of horses. Despite the devastation, the Soviet advance accelerated. The Red Army's momentum became unstoppable, driven by both strategic necessity and propaganda. Newspapers across the USSR celebrated the liberation of the left bank, declaring that the Dnieper would soon be crossed in triumph. But inside the ranks, exhaustion was universal. Units had been fighting continuously for months, often at half their nominal strength. The constant presence of commissars ensured that morale remained high on paper, but private letters and diaries reveal the truth. Soldiers who crossed the tributaries did so not out of confidence, but out of resignation. "There is nowhere else to go," one sergeant wrote near the Soch. "Behind us lies the earth that burns." Hitler's insistence on defending every meter of ground forced commanders into suicidal counterattacks. Entire regiments were ordered to recapture positions already lost multiple times. Desertion became a growing problem, particularly among non-German auxiliary troops. Reports from Army Group Center mention mass surrenders of Romanian, Hungarian, and even Ostlegion units unwilling to continue fighting in the collapsing front. Nevertheless, some German formations maintained remarkable cohesion. At Rachitsa, a small garrison of the 102nd Infantry Division held out for 9 days against repeated Soviet assaults, allowing thousands of retreating soldiers to cross to safety. By mid-November, the Red Army had achieved all immediate objectives east of the Dnieper. The Desna and Soch were fully crossed, and bridgeheads were expanding daily. Soviet forces had liberated much of northern Ukraine and southern Belarus, while the cost of this success was almost unimaginable: hundreds of thousands dead, cities destroyed, and entire provinces depopulated. Yet for Stalin, it represented the necessary price for what came next: the crossing of the Dnieper proper, the river of destiny. The battles along its tributaries had served their grim purpose. They had trained Soviet commanders in riverine warfare, exposed weaknesses in German coordination, and hardened the soldiers who survived. Now, as winter began to close in and the first snow fell across the devastated landscape, the stage was set for one of the most ambitious operations of the war: the assault on the Dnieper itself, where the outcome would determine not just control of Ukraine, but the direction of the Eastern Front for the rest of the conflict. The onset of winter in November 1943 transformed the battle along the Dnieper's tributaries into a confrontation of endurance rather than maneuver. Snow began to fall heavily across northern Ukraine and southern Belarus, covering the burned landscapes and frozen rivers that had consumed hundreds of thousands of lives. Soviet bridgeheads, once muddy and chaotic, solidified under frost, turning into fortified enclaves bristling with artillery. Both sides struggled to adapt to the new conditions. For the Red Army, winter offered stability. For the Wehrmacht, it signified encirclement. The Central and Voronezh fronts used this pause to reorganize their exhausted formations. Divisions that had been reduced to a fraction of their original strength were merged or reinforced by reserve units from Siberia and the Urals. Despite these innovations, supply shortages remained severe. At the front line, soldiers rationed bread to 300 grams per day, while fuel was prioritized for tanks and artillery. German forces west of the tributaries faced even harsher conditions. Hitler's prohibition on strategic withdrawals forced divisions to hold exposed positions along the riverbanks that offered little natural protection. The Second Army, defending the sector from Chernigov to Gomel, had lost nearly half of its manpower and most of its heavy weapons. Artillery batteries were down to a few dozen shells per gun. The Luftwaffe, now nearly absent from the skies, could not provide air cover or resupply. German soldiers built shelters out of frozen earth and destroyed barns, enduring temperatures that plunged to minus 20 degrees Celsius at night. Letters from soldiers of the 7th Infantry Division described frostbite, hunger, and the despair of fighting without warmth, without rest, without hope. Yet even in these desperate circumstances, both sides continued limited operations. Soviet reconnaissance units probed the riverbanks daily, testing German defenses for weaknesses. At night, patrols crossed on skis or in small boats, engaging in brief firefights before retreating. German troops answered with ambushes, laying mines along likely crossing routes. The front froze into a deadly rhythm of raids and counter-raids, where gains were measured not in kilometers but in meters. Behind the lines, the civilian population suffered perhaps the most. The regions liberated by the Red Army were in ruins, infrastructure destroyed, fields burned, livestock gone. The retreating Germans had implemented a policy of total devastation, ensuring that the advancing Soviets inherited wasteland rather than functioning territory. Villages along the Soj and Desna had populations reduced by more than 70%, either evacuated, executed, or deported. Soviet authorities attempted to restore minimal governance by deploying restoration detachments, composed of engineers, doctors, and NKVD officers. Their task was as political as it was practical: rebuild bridges, establish supply centers, and root out collaborators. The NKVD's presence marked a dark continuation of the struggle. In liberated zones, investigations began immediately to identify local inhabitants accused of aiding the Germans. Many were executed without trial. At the same time, partisan groups that had fought heroically behind enemy lines were often ordered to disband or integrated forcibly into regular Red Army units. The transition from occupation to liberation was neither clean nor peaceful. For civilians, it meant exchanging one authority for another, both demanding loyalty under threat. The Red Army's High Command, analyzing the autumn campaign, began preparing for the next offensive phase, securing the western bank of the Dnieper. The lessons of the tributary battles were studied in detail. Reports emphasized the need for synchronized artillery support, improved coordination between infantry and engineers, and better protection for bridging equipment. In December, training programs were established behind the front to prepare specialized river crossing units. These formations included amphibious tanks, assault engineers, and smoke generator battalions, an unprecedented concentration of resources for a single strategic objective. On the German side, preparations were equally intense but defensive in nature. The Dnieper was now the last natural barrier before the Ukrainian plains. Field Marshal Manstein, commanding Army Group South, understood that holding the river was. He reorganized his depleted forces into flexible Kampfgruppen, ad hoc battle groups designed to respond rapidly to Soviet breakthroughs. Defensive lines were constructed with multiple fallback positions, supported by minefields and anti-tank obstacles. However, the lack of manpower and materials meant that many of these fortifications existed only on paper. Reports from the 8th Army described defensive belts without guns, trenches without men. As the year came to an end, the riverine front remained in stalemate. Snowdrifts muffled artillery fire, and the frozen tributaries served as temporary roads. Soviet convoys moved supplies across the ice, while German patrols sabotaged them under cover of darkness. Occasionally, the fragile calm broke into sudden violence. On December 28th, Soviet forces launched a limited offensive near Rachitsa, attempting to widen a bridgehead. Both sides lost over 3,000 men in a single day for no strategic change. The psychological toll was immense. For Soviet troops, months of relentless combat had dulled any sense of triumph. They fought not for glory, but to survive the next dawn. For the Germans, the realization that they were fighting a losing war began to spread through every rank. Commanders spoke in cautious tones, fearing the wrath of higher authority, while soldiers whispered about rumors of retreats in the south and collapses on other fronts. Nevertheless, even amid the bleakness, each army prepared for what both knew was inevitable: another massive offensive. Soviet plans called for simultaneous assaults across multiple sectors of the Dnieper and its tributaries once the ice melted. German forces, lacking the reserves to counter such a blow, pinned their hopes on holding until the Dnieper's tributaries, once merely lines on a map, had become symbols of endurance and ruin. Beneath the ice, the rivers concealed thousands of dead, soldiers and civilians alike, whose bodies had frozen where they fell. Above them, two armies waited for the thaw, knowing that when the rivers ran again, so too would the blood. The battle was far from over. It had merely paused under a thin, deceptive layer of snow. When the ice began to thaw in March 1944, the rivers that had lain silent through the winter awakened with a roar. The Dnieper's tributaries, the Desna, the Soj, and countless smaller streams flooded their banks, washing away minefields, trenches, and bridges. Entire sectors of the front were cut off as roads disappeared under torrents of water. but to the Red Army, fresh divisions equipped with the latest T-34-85 tanks arrived from the factories beyond the Urals. New artillery units, supported by American-supplied Studebaker trucks under Lend-Lease, transformed Soviet mobility. Supply lines that had once been tenuous now flowed with ammunition, food, and fuel. Entire field railways were laid across the frozen ground to bring material closer to the front. Stalin and the Stavka had decided the winter lull was over, and the Dnieper line must fall before the Germans could recover from the disasters elsewhere. Operation to liberate the right bank began with reconnaissance in force across the tributaries. On March 6, 1944, the Central Front's 65th and 70th Armies launched simultaneous assaults along the Sauge River. Engineers advanced first, crawling across partially thawed ice under cover of darkness to establish rope bridges. When dawn broke, thousands of infantrymen crossed behind them. German artillery opened fire, shattering the thin ice and sending men plunging into the freezing current. Entire platoons vanished beneath the water. Yet the Soviet advance continued, driven by orders that allowed no retreat. The Wehrmacht, now reduced to a defensive shadow of its former self, attempted to resist. Army Group Center deployed what remained of its armored reserves, the 20th Panzer and 36th Infantry Divisions, to block the crossings near Gomel. But their strength was illusory. German formations often consisted of little more than battalion-sized Kampfgruppen. Ammunition shortages forced commanders to ration shells, and the Luftwaffe could no longer contest Soviet air superiority. Red Air Force aircraft operating from makeshift airstrips east of the river dominated the skies. IL-2s strafed German trenches. The battles of early March demonstrated a new pattern of warfare. The Soviets no longer fought simply to push the Germans back. They fought to encircle and annihilate. Soviet operational doctrine, refined after the lessons of 1943, emphasized deep penetration and coordination between tank and infantry armies. Once a breach was achieved, mobile units would sweep around German flanks, severing escape routes. This strategy proved devastating. In the area north of Gomel, the 48th Army broke through the German lines and trapped elements of the 35th Infantry Division in a flooded forest near Vetka. The surrounded German soldiers, cut off from supplies, tried to hold for 3 days before surrendering. Nearly 7,000 men were captured. Few survived the march to the rear. For civilians, the Soviet offensive brought both liberation and terror. Villages long under occupation witnessed the arrival of Soviet troops, but celebrations were short-lived. German rearguards often burned settlements before withdrawing, leaving only ash and corpses. In some regions, battles took place directly among civilian homes. Villagers sought shelter in cellars, while artillery duels raged overhead. When the Soviets reclaimed the towns, they often found populations reduced by half, survivors skeletal from hunger. Reports from the Gomel region recorded that more than 80% of the rural infrastructure was destroyed, wells poisoned, livestock slaughtered, churches mined. In several towns, the advancing troops encountered mass graves from German executions of forced laborers. In response to the deteriorating situation, the German High Command ordered a general withdrawal to the Bug and Narrow rivers, but Hitler's orders still forbade any retreat without his personal approval. This contradiction led to chaos. Commanders like General Tippelskirch, responsible for the defense around Moser, sent unauthorized evacuation orders to save their divisions, while others, fearing court-martial, remained until their units were surrounded. The result was fragmentation. Some German units managed to retreat in good order. Others were wiped out entirely. By the end of March, the Soviet forces had advanced nearly 150 kilometers westward in some sectors. The Sauge and Desna were fully crossed, and bridgeheads extended deep into formerly occupied Belarus. The Red Army's offensive momentum became unstoppable. Soviet tank corps surged along thawing roads, overrunning German positions before they could reorganize. Yet progress was not without cost. The spring floods claimed as many lives as the fighting. Tanks and trucks drowned in mud, bridges collapsed under their own weight, and soldiers suffered from frostbite and exhaustion. In the Central Front alone, more than 25,000 soldiers were evacuated for illness in March. The retreating Germans turned to defensive scorched earth tactics. Mines and booby traps littered every road and bridge. Whole towns were wired for demolition, detonated as Soviet forces entered. The retreat from the tributaries mirrored the earlier withdrawal from Smolensk, a disciplined destruction of everything left behind. Still, this only delayed the inevitable. By April 1944, the front had moved decisively west of the Dnieper's tributaries. The rivers that had burned with war now flowed freely again, but they carried with them the wreckage of an empire in retreat. Debris of pontoon bridges, tanks, and corpses floated downstream past villages that no longer existed. For both armies, the campaign on the tributaries had changed the nature of the war. It proved that no natural line could stop the Red Army's advance. Not rivers, not mud, not winter itself. And yet, beneath the triumph, exhaustion was total. Soviet soldiers who stood on the western banks of the Soj or the Desna could see the ruins of villages stretching to the horizon. The land they had fought to reclaim was dead, stripped of everything but silence. Still, behind them, trains of reinforcements and ammunition continued to arrive, and in front of them stretched Europe itself. The Dnieper and its tributaries were no longer the goal. They were the beginning of the road that would lead to Warsaw, Königsberg, and eventually Berlin. The rivers of Ukraine had been conquered, but at the cost of drowning the country in its own blood. By late April 1944, the fighting along the Dnieper's tributaries entered its final and most decisive phase. The German forces, now fully committed to a defensive retreat, clung to remnants of their former line. The Red Army, pressing forward with renewed determination, launched a series of operations designed not only to clear the river valleys, but to destroy the German field armies that had survived the winter battles. The operation that began as a struggle for crossings had evolved into a war of annihilation. Soviet High Command issued orders for continuous advance operations across the entire central sector. Rokossovsky's Belarusian front spearheaded the drive, supported by the 48th and 65th Armies, while Vatutin's 1st Ukrainian Front moved southward along parallel routes toward the Pripyat marshes. The objective was simple but immense: force the Wehrmacht completely out of Ukraine and threaten the German-held regions of Poland from the south. The plan relied on maintaining relentless pressure, denying the enemy time to regroup. To achieve this, Soviet supply units extended logistical lines across still-flooded lowlands, using makeshift causeways of logs and stones to transport ammunition and fuel. The German Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Busch, attempted to stabilize its line along a series of secondary rivers, the Iput, the Pronia, and the Dnieper tributaries north of Mogilev. However, such positions were defensive illusions. The Soviet bridgeheads along the Soj and Desna had already outflanked these barriers. Wehrmacht engineers built new defenses in haste, relying heavily on anti-tank obstacles and minefields. The fortifications, though formidable on maps, were undermanned and poorly supplied. The Ninth Army, which was responsible for the central sector, had been reduced to approximately 110,000 effective troops. These units often found themselves far ahead of the main body, fighting isolated battles against rearguards or remnants of German columns. The emphasis was no longer on capturing specific terrain, but on preventing the enemy from establishing any new defensive line. Soviet radio intercepts confirmed that German field headquarters had lost contact with several corps entirely. The final German stand east of the Bug occurred near the small town of Kovel, where remnants of multiple divisions attempted to defend a railway junction vital for evacuation. The battle, fought from May 4th to May 10th, epitomized the chaos of the retreat. Soviet tanks, bogged down in marshes, engaged German anti-tank guns at point-blank range, while infantry fought in trenches half filled with water. The town changed hands 4 times before the German garrison was annihilated. Of the roughly 15,000 men who defended Kovel,